Good afternoon and welcome to San Mateo Arboretum Society's Zoom seminar talking about the birds and the bees with Joan Morris. The program will last approximately 30 to 45 minutes and it will be recorded. I'm Pat Paquette, a education committee member and greenhouse volunteer here at the Arboretum. Feel free to submit questions at any time during the presentation. The speaker prefers to wait till the end to answer questions. However, you need clarification, handle the presentation. So the chat box at the bottom of the screen and type in your question. Few days after the presentation, you'll be emailed a link to the recording and a link to an evaluation form to provide feedback. Before we start, a little bit of information about what's happening at the Arboretum. Our nursery in San Mateo Central Park is open 11 to 2 on Saturdays and Sundays. Entry is at the north gate. Payment is by credit card, debit card, or Apple Pay. No cash is accepted. Check our website, sanmateoarboretum.org, or call 650-579-0536, extension 2 for updated information. While you're at Central Park, be sure to visit the Rose Garden, the Butterfly and Hummingbird Garden, and our new demonstration gardens. All are maintained by the Arboretum Society volunteers. In addition, there is an outdoor art exhibit open 10 to 3 Saturday and Sunday in the Arboretum Society's Victorian Garden. The current exhibition is presented by students at College of San Mateo, digital media students, and it's focusing on flora and fauna. Before I introduce Joan, we would like to, we had a presentation to some, not a presentation, a workshop for some students at, I believe it is Hillsborough Elementary School on bees. And these students had previously made, some, you'll see on the screen, some bee houses. So there are 4 of them for sale, and they're $15 a piece. I think they're pretty nice looking. And if you're interested, you can email us at education.sanmateoarboretum.org, or you can call and leave a message, 650-579-0536. So we have 4 of them. If we have a lot of interest, then it'll be first come, first serve. Okay, on to our speaker. Today's workshop presenter is Joan Morris. Joan has been a reporter for 44 years, including the last 34 in the Bay Area News Group. She was home and garden editor from 2006 to 2012 when she became the paper's pet and wildlife columnist. Joan still reports on gardening and is the founder of Our Garden, a Contra Costa Master Gardener demonstration garden in Walnut Creek. Free classes are taught at the garden every Wednesday from April through October, and produce grown at the garden is donated to the Monument Crisis Center in Concord. The garden donates about 14,000 pounds of fresh vegetables and fruit every year. That's pretty impressive. Joan lives in Brentwood with her trusty dog, Bailey, a Chihuahua who thinks he's a Great Dane. So with that, I will turn it over to Joan.
Thanks, Pat. And I just want to say I'm really happy to be here on a really nice Sunday. Hopefully people are able to get outside and enjoy this cool weather and avoid the rain, but of course we love the rain. So I'm going to talk about birds and bees and pollination, why it's important to have pollinators in your garden, and some ways to attract them to your garden. And I have a slideshow prepared, but I will warn you, this is the first time I've ever done it on a Zoom, so I hope I don't mess it up. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen. And somewhere
Joan, I think you can click on the top right tab, the birds and the bees. You click on that. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm having trouble. There we go. I was having trouble seeing the top line of my screen. Every time I went that way, it got covered. So anyway, this is birds and bees and creating a pollinator's garden. And some of the common pollinators that you're likely to see in your garden and that you want to attract to your garden are obviously bees. I think everyone knows about bees. Hummingbirds, you may not realize that hummingbirds also do an important job of pollination. Oops, this should be butterflies, not better lies. Wasps, wind, and even humans can do some pollination. Bees are the most common pollinator in the world, responsible for pollinating 80% of all flowering plants and more than 130 types of fruits and vegetables. If we didn't have honeybees, you wouldn't be able to see half of the fruits and vegetables in the grocery stores. That's one reason that there's so much concern about threats to honeybees and colony collapse and that sort of thing, is because we rely on them so much in commercial agriculture, but also in our own vegetable gardens and landscapes. There are 7 species of honeybees, and this may be surprising, but they are not native to this continent. The honeybees came here with the early European settlers who brought hives primarily for the honey. I'm not sure they realized what role that the bees played in pollination. The European honeybees have been here since the 1600s. But they are, because they're not native, they tend to singularly focus on one type of plant at a time. So if you have fields of lavender, they'll go and pollinate and visit every single plant in that field and ignore any other plants that are growing in an adjacent field. So while they do an excellent job at that pollination, they aren't really that useful in a backyard where you have many different types. So for that, we rely on native bees. And native bees rather outnumber the honeybees. There's 20,000 different species. And in California, we have 1,600. They range in size from large bumblebees to ones so tiny that you can just barely see them. They're like little tiny flies. And these guys really are the workhorse. They will pollinate any flower that they come across or try. Hummingbirds are great pollinators. The 4 most common hummers in the Bay Area are the Annas, the Allens, the Rufus, and the black-chinned. Annas are the most common because they remain here all year long, while the others migrate in and out. Wind is an important pollinator. And I live in Brentwood, and it seems like it's windy here pretty much all the time. Maybe that's why we grow so much corn out here. Plants that benefit from wind pollination are grown relatively close together so that they benefit from the wind pollination. So the most common, of course, is corn. And wind pollinated plants usually have no flowers to speak of and are fairly monotone in color, being primarily green. They don't need flowers, aroma, color to attract bees or other pollinators because they aren't relying on live pollinators. Other pollinators are butterflies, wasps, and as I mentioned, humans. In butterflies, it's primarily the adult that does the pollination, the larvae or the caterpillar are eating the plant. They aren't really spreading the pollen around. And as much as we might dislike yellow jackets and other wasps and hornets, they do pollinate some plants. They're not as efficient at it, but if you're trying to find a good reason to let them stay in your yard, not have to deal with trying to get rid of them, then that's a plus mark on their side. And we can, as humans, can be very helpful in pollinating plants. Often the common plants or the common problems that you see when humans need to step in or can step in is when you have a plant that produces both male and female flowers, but only male flowers are showing. And the other issue is timing. This problem is seen very often in squash. You produce a lot of blooms and you start to see a little squash forming and you think, oh good, I'm about to be up to my ears in squash, but then that little squash shrivels and never forms. That's because it wasn't pollinated. To get, if you only have male flowers, and you can tell the male and female, if you look closely at the stem, the male has a straight stem and then the bloom, and the female will have a little swelling before you get to the bloom, and that's the ovum. So just like in humans, has a little ovary there. So to get more male flowers, really all you have to do is find one leaf on the plant and crush it. Leave it on the plant, don't pull it off. And that act sends a signal to the plant that it's being threatened and it better start producing. It needs to reproduce and make sure it continues, which is what the plant's whole goal is to produce offspring. But anyway, crushing one leaf on a plant can cause female flowers to appear. Also, an issue with squash is that the female flower opens early in the morning, but the male flowers usually don't open till later. So unless that timing is right when both are open and receptive, you aren't going to get fertilization. So in that case, you want to do some hand pollination. And there's a couple of ways to do that. You can take a Q-tip and gently rub the anther. I never remember the parts, but the part that has the pollen on it, and gather some pollen and then take it to the female flower and just gently brush it around. That will pollinate. Some people like to pluck a male flower off and then invert it into the female and twist it and transfer the pollen that way. But those are both very effective ways of doing your own pollination. And squash flowers are large, so it's much easier than trying to do like a little tiny flower. Bees are attracted to flowering plants and healthy landscapes. So you want to encourage them to to visit your garden. Things you need to do to make sure that they see there's a welcome mat is you want to have some fresh water out for them. And that's not a bird bath. Bird baths are too deep for bees and they can easily drown or get trapped and drown. So you want a shallow bowl, put some rocks in it and make sure that at least some of the rocks are above the surface of the water. But that gives the bees a perching place so that they can dip down and drink without falling in. Muddy areas in your garden, that's probably not a problem unless you're doing extreme drought gardening. But just a little bit of muddy area is good. They use that for building their nest, the native bees do. You want nests, like the bee boxes that you just saw, and nesting areas for bees. You want some place where they can shelter, get out of the sun, sit for a while, escape predators. So some nice shady areas in your yard are good for the bees. Spots to rest, ledges, even on edges of pots, just places where they can easily take a break. As far as plants, native plants are the best attractors for native bees. If you think about it, it makes perfect sense. The bees are native here, the plants are native here. They know what they're looking for, they adjust to each other. And native plants usually have blooms that the native bees like. You also might consider when you're planting your garden, or if you're adding to your garden, that instead of having a heavy mix of flowers, of different flowers, if you group them in maybe 3x3 pots or grouped together, it makes it easier for the bee to come and visit like one specific plant and then move on to another specific plant. But it just makes it a little easier for them. They don't get as worn out. Some favorite native plants that will attract bees. I'm going to let you read this list because I butcher Latin. But the aster is a great plant. Ceanothus, California lilac, western redbud, California poppy, which happens to be my very favorite flower. The bees love California poppy. Blanket flower, lavenders of all sorts, but Goodwin Creek Gray is an excellent one. Catmint, not catnip, but catmint. Catmint is a great one. Russian sage, germander sage, which is salvia. Salvias are great at attracting a lot of pollinators. Cascade Creek goldenrod, or Solidago californica. Cascade Creek is another great native plant. Now, tips for attracting butterflies. You want to grow nectar producing plants for the adults and other plants for the caterpillars. So you need two types of plants because the caterpillars are going to eat those plants. I get at least once a year a letter from a reader who's horrified that they bought milkweed and that something is eating it. Well, the something is the monarch caterpillar. That's what they do. They eat the plant, and then they form the cocoon and a chrysalis, and then they become the butterfly. And butterflies don't eat plants at all. They just drink the nectar, and they take the nectar from other plants, not just the milkweed. Like with the bees, you want some fresh water and shelter for them as well. Hummingbirds aren't as good as pollinating as bees, but they're second best. And they are responsible for pollinating most of the world's wildflowers. To get hummingbirds to visit your yard, you want to grow plants with long tubular flowers. And hummingbirds are attracted to the colors red and purple. If you have feeders out for the hummingbirds, you might consider reducing the number and instead growing plants that they like. You want to create a runway by setting out, almost like if you've seen a landing strip at night at the airport, there's like a row of lights that directs the planes. You want to do that with your planting. Just have rows of red and purple going into your yard, and that will help them find the rest of the the plants. And like with the bees, you want to plant in clumps. Now, if your garden is already full or you don't have a lot of plant space, using red decorations will also attract hummingbirds. And if you can get them into your yard and they can find the plants that you have there, that's your first step. And I know someone who hung a Canadian flag in their backyard because it's very heavily red. And all of a sudden she had tons of hummingbirds coming to her feeders. So if you're wanting hummingbirds to visit, the welcome mat should definitely be red. It's kind of important to know how that these various creatures do the pollination. That helps you decide what types of plants that you're going to plant. Bees feed on nectar, and as they're inside the blossom, they get covered with pollen. And then they transfer that to the next bloom that they visit. Bumblebees use something called buzz pollination, where they like blooms that are point more downward, and they like to get up inside them. They're upside down and they buzz, and the buzzing causes the pollen to fall on their bellies, and then they transfer that to the next flower. And some of it, when they're in their buzzing, also falls down to lower plants. That's how the pollen gets spread with them. Hummingbirds and other birds that assist with pollination usually have long beaks and the ability to hover. The nectars contain deep inside tubular-shaped flowers that have no significant scent. With few exceptions, the turkey vulture being one of them, birds don't have a great sense of smell. Instead, they're attracted to vivid colors, and the colors that most birds see the best are the reds and purples. So again, when you're thinking about plants that you want to attract birds in, you want to do the long tubular blossoms, and you don't have to find ones that have a heavy scent. Those are just for you. Hummingbirds have a lot of favorite flowers that you can grow, plants that you can grow. Manzanitas are really good. Chaparral currant, fuchsia flowering gooseberry, pink flowering currant, black sage, Vicky monkey flower, hummingbird sage, western columbine. They also like scarlet bugler, scarlet monkey flower, California fuchsia, penstemon, rosemary, almost any of the salvias, borage. Live forever is a native succulent. Coyote mint, most herbs, although for those of us who grow herbs, you know that we usually are out there pinching off the flowers to get the plant to keep producing. But you might consider planting a pot for the birds and letting it go to flower. Mexican sunflower is a beautiful flower, and it also attracts hummingbirds. Lavender, blanket flower. A lot of people plant, I have such trouble saying this word, so I'll just call it butterfly bush. It's little it attracts a lot of pollinators, but recently there's been a move to discourage planting it because it is invasive. It spreads rather quickly, and it's hard to contain it in your own backyard, and so it can get out into open space, and it's starting to cause some problems there. So if you already have it, I go ahead and leave it, but I wouldn't plant any new. When you're thinking of gardening for bees and birds, think about having a variety of colors and heights. You want some taller, medium sized, and shorter ones that will accommodate different insects, different bees, different birds, and give them a large area to feed at. Again, clump plants together rather than scattering them around your yard. When you go to buy a seedling or buy seeds, check the bloom date. If you can manage to grow a variety of plants that bloom at different times of the year, that extends the time that these pollinators will be in your yard. If you have a vegetable garden, interplant with blooming plants, with ornamentals. I always grow zinnias and marigolds in my beds. And you want to plant in the sun. You create the resting places in the shade, but the plants with pollinators you want to be in as much sun as they can get. There's also some things to avoid in your yard. Hybrids, most are sterile, and so they produce no pollen. So while they're beautiful, they're not going to attract pollinators. And that doesn't mean you can't grow them. You just want to have some other plants around that do attract pollinators. Hydrangea is a common one that, because it is so hybridized, it doesn't produce. Avoid the overuse of insecticides. I know sometimes that as much as we try to be, have an organic and accepting garden, sometimes the insects can just overrun you and you have to do something. So if you get to that point where you have to use an insecticide, look for the one that is the most nature friendly, and don't overuse it. Follow the directions as they are written. And for some of us, that means actually reading the directions for the very first time. But if a little works, then don't think a lot will work even better. You also want to avoid systemic fertilizers, and these fertilizers actually put the insecticide inside the plant tissue. So when like a bee feeds at it with the pollen, it can then take on the insecticide. And the big one, that's the big boogie there right now, is neonicotinoids. They're a class of water-soluble insecticides that are chemically related to nicotine. They can be sprayed on the foliage, but they are most effective against sucking insects when sprayed on the ground where the plant's roots takes up the chemicals and distributes it throughout the plant. When an insect eats or drinks the sap, it consumes the poison. Initially, neonicotinoids were praised for their low toxicity to many beneficial insects, including bees. However, recently this claim has been called into question. New research points to potential toxicity to bees and other beneficial insects through low-level contamination of nectar and pollen. Although these low-level exposures do not normally kill the bees directly, there's a lot of belief that they impact the bees' ability to forage for nectar, learn and remember where the flowers are located, and possibly impair their ability to find their way home to their nest or hive. Researchers and backyard gardeners have started reporting that they're finding dead bees that haven't been killed by insecticide, but from starvation or being left out in the elements because there's something in this neonicotinoids that clouds their brain. And they kind of forget how to be bees and how to find their way home. There are other birds that are pollinators besides the hummingbird. When a bird carries out pollination, it's called ornithophory. I practiced pronouncing that, and I probably still got it wrong. These birds include spider hunters, sunbirds, honey creepers, honey eaters, and orioles. So we don't have all of these birds in the Bay Area. We definitely have orioles, and I believe we have honey eaters, and maybe sunbirds on occasion. But any bird that you can attract to your yard usually turns out to be beneficial to you. They eat a lot of insects, including what many that we consider bad or harmful bugs. Their presence is a sign of a healthy garden and balance with nature. They can also provide unexpected propagation. And by that, I mean the birds eat seeds or eat something that has seeds in it. The seed passes through their digestive system and comes out in bird poop. And some plants require this for propagation. The covering on their seed is so hard, it needs the digestive juices of a bird or other animal to remove that coating so that then it can sprout. So I've had many unexpected plants come up in my yard thanks to the birds. I once just noticed I had this rather large fig tree in a corner of my yard, and that had been planted by a bird. So I know that birds can be messy. If they tap on your window during mating season because they're confused, they can be slightly annoying, but having birds in your yard is just a positive all around. And so I would encourage you to grow things for the birds and take what they have to give you. Here are some links that you might find helpful in trying to decide what types of plants that you want to grow. The Xerces organization has a lot of suggestions. Pollinator.org has booklets, downloadable booklets of pollinator plant recommendations by region. The Native Plant Finder, or you can search by zip code. I think that's a little bit of an overkill because even though we have tons of microclimates, it's not that hard to find native plants that will grow throughout the Bay Area, but kind of fun to see what maybe originally was in your zip code area. And again, the Xerces has a pollinator plants for California has plant listings. So that kind of wraps up my presentation, and I am available for questions or suggestions or thoughts that you may have about pollinators.
Okay. Thanks, Joan, for that interesting presentation. I think we all learned something new about our friends, bees, the birds, and pollination. So if you have questions, like I said, please go to the chat icon at the bottom of the screen and send us any question you might have. There is one question here. Nicotiana is fragrant and long flowering. Is it harmful to bees?
I don't know that specific plant. If it is in the nicotine family, then it likely is harmful. But if it's not in a nicotine plant family, then it's probably fine.
Okay. Do we have any other questions? We'll wait a few minutes.
Oh, I was just looking up the plant And it's in the Solanaceae family, which, as we all know, is part of the nightshade family. But it is a tobacco. It's cultivated for tobacco leaves. So when you grow anything that has that's in the tobacco family, you can risk harming your other plants because nicotine does not play well with other plants. So I wouldn't put it in my yard.
Okay, we have another question. Roses are hybrids. Are they useless for pollinators as well?
No, roses are one of the exceptions. And there's a lot of exceptions. They do produce pollen, and they are good at attracting the pollinators that are usually the right colors. And even though like birds aren't attracted to the scent, they're still a good plant to have in the yard. They don't require, oh, wait a minute. They may require bees to pollinate. Some plants don't need a pollinator. They're self-pollinating, but I believe roses do require pollination. So it would be good to have bees visiting them.
Okay, well, we'll give it another minute or two. I don't see any other. Oh, here's a question. What are some common tubular flowers for pollinators?
The ones that I had listed here before. Oops, not too far. A lot of these have those tubular flowers on them. Like the sage definitely does, and the fuchsia. I think almost all of these have tubular flowers. Penstemon definitely does. Rosemary, not so much, but a lot of the salvias do, and borage does, I believe.
So Joan, if someone wanted a list of these flowers, would you be willing to share that with our participants?
Yes, I will email you this slide deck and correcting some of the things that I thought I corrected and apparently not. Some of the spelling errors.
Oh, well.
Like this should be capitalized. So
Okay.
yeah, I'll be happy to do that. And again, I would encourage you all to go to one of these sites for a better list and more comprehensive, and probably way more than you're ever going to want.
Okay.
We want a lot as gardeners.
Another question is, are lights at night harmful to bees?
Bees are pretty much in bed by sundown. So no, they aren't harmful.
Okay, so I guess we will move on. As I mentioned earlier, you'll be emailed a link to the recording and presentation and an evaluation form. Any unanswered questions can be addressed at that time. We would really appreciate any feedback you can give us about what worked and where you think we can improve. Please join us for future seminars and workshops on July 10th. Stuart Dalton will speak on summer rose care. Stu is a frequent speaker at the Arboretum and an expert on rose care. He's active in the Peninsula Rose Society and is a consulting rosarian for the American Rose Society. Thanks to Joan and Kevin Wilkinson, our Zoom technical specialist. If you are interested in volunteering at the Arboretum, you can email us at info@sanmataoarboretum.org, or you can call us at 650-579-0536. Thank you for joining us today. When there's one comment, thank you for the presentation. The plant lists are very helpful, as are the links. Appreciate the time you spent. Okay, thank you for that comment, and thank you for your questions and for your participation. The program is now concluded.